Yes! Oh, it's a big one. Crazy. It's going to drop me. It's going to belt me off this. There's a big log there. I'm not confident at all. Well, you're going to have... Oh, it had a big mate with it too. I got the smaller of the two, and this one's in the high 40s. That log just had jack written all over it. The action on these things is just insane. And the jacks love them. Oh, what an absolute corker. Look at the size of this thing. Yeah, you ripper. Take a look in there. I'll get him out and give you a look at him. I'm actually up fishing in brackish water, so there's a chance that I'll be getting bass, and I have had some bass hits on him, but there's no mistaking a jack when he hits, and they don't miss very often. The weedless worm hooks sometimes get criticised because of the hookup rate, but with a mangrove jack, it's just about a sure thing. Look at him out. Look at him out. Got the fish shakes, the nerves are through the roof. Everything goes when you hook one of these things. Just lose it, eh? There we go, he's biting down on the net, so I'm just going to let him go for a little bit. But these Godham shads, they've got a really tight wobble. There's only a couple of the plastics out on the market that have got that, but these have got a much better finish. And so I've been flicking it in around all of this cover and finding the deep bends and the ends of these creeks on the Gold Coast is just fantastic with this style of fishing. So much fun. This is the ultimate challenge in my book, to come up in natural structure with a kayak, use your stealth and get in and flick hard against the structure and just hang on. It's hard in mouth stuff. I absolutely love it. Have a look at this brute. There's the Godham shad, just rigged weedless with that little weight underneath, and then they belt him with such aggression. It's just great sport fishing. Have a look at the size of this house. The least they could have done is a rock wall and a couple of pontoons, just saying. Well, in this video, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through some tactics on how to skip cast. I'll just fix that up. I've just come around the corner this morning and there's some boys here in a boat. You might see them as I'm spinning around. And they've been skip casting for 48 hours they're up to. And we're talking about how to get on a more mangrove jack. And I said, they're like, look, are you going to make another video for the session? And I said, well, I'm pretty much inspired to now, based on the fact these boys have been putting in so much time to try and get their first jack. I said, have you been hit? He's like, oh, I think I might have had one before I'm... And I couldn't brag it to him, but I was like, no, you haven't. That's a no. Because if you're skip casting and chasing jack, you're pretty much sure when it hits. Because it's like a steam train going the other way. So this video is going to be about all of my skip casting tactics and what I like to do when I get out on the water, and I might try to make it a little bit more about in the kayak. But if you don't fish from a kayak and you're not skip casting out of a yak, then it's still going to have plenty of gold in here for you to think about, just to help get your catch rates and your hits happening a little bit more frequently. Hopefully put you onto some more mangrove jack. So what I'll do, I'll talk about, I've already spoken about the gear and my favourite lures for skip casting in some recent videos, and I've got some action videos and adventure videos that have a lot of skip casting in them on my channel. So if you haven't seen them, or if you're wanting to learn how to skip cast, check out some of my earlier skip casting videos and that'll point you in the right direction. But this video is going to be more about the tactics and how I try to present the lure and just my approach and what I look for along the bank. So I'll grab a setup and talk you through it as I'm doing it, basically. That's what I reckon might be the best way to go. You can see this morning, like, I'm ducking golf balls. I can hear every now and then these people next to me are, there's a golf course right there. Makes me as nervous jack fishing and then dialing it up with golf balls. Crazy. But this is what we're going to do, right? I'm going to keep the motor going and just cruising along this bank and try to talk you through how I like to do it. So the first thing I reckon we need to touch on is using the tide and the time of your presentation, what you should be trying to aim for, right? You can see now it's sort of getting a little bit long in the tooth, and early this morning there was like a coinciding rising tide, still with enough water off the bottom of these trees so that I had low light conditions and gaps under the tree so I could skip in there during a bite period. And that's really what you want to do. You have a look at it now and the tide's full. The bottoms of these trees, not here but in there, in here, the bottoms of the trees are actually touching, so it's really difficult to get your lure in. And so your tactic has to change. You're kind of trying to punch it in between the little gaps between the mangroves now. Just run into a massive stick. Hang on. Caught a massive stick under the guy. Just power through it. Hang on. Alright. Got it. So you can see it a little bit better here, right? So the tide, and it's a bigger tide, so we're approaching a full moon now, is basically going to drown the bottom of these mangrove trees, and then it becomes really difficult to get in there. Doesn't mean that you still can't do it and catch jack, but you just throw them to the periphery. So when it's like this, you want to be trying to punch in, get into the little gaps as much as you can, and if they're shadowed gaps, you're trying to get way up in behind, and often the jacks are going to be sitting on those edges or come screaming out from underneath and come into those gaps, because the bait also sits in those gaps. And you'll notice sometimes when you're throwing in there, you'll just spook a little bit of bait. That tells you that you're in the right sort of zone. So ideally what you're trying to do is either get a falling tide, like the top half of the falling tide or the top half of the run in, and then basically now when it's stale like this and you can see all this debris and stuff just sitting here, it can make it quite difficult to do it. And this is when I might actually go to a diving lure. When there's no run, I like to try and stir them up a little bit with like a diving lure or a popper. But I still want to take you through it, right? So the tide that you're looking for is that top half. Once the tide's receded down the bank, or it's drained out and there's actually no like bank cover to really fish, your options are limited with what you're trying to skip in and around. So that's what I try to look for. When I'm fishing, I try to bring the lure back with the tide, but that means that if you're heading along a bank, you have to be going against the tide. And if you don't have a motor or like a Hobie where you're using your feet to pedal and propel yourself up against the tide, it's kind of unrealistic to think that you're going to be able to paddle and run against the tide and keep casting and skipping and being satisfied with your session. So that's more something that you can do, like a luxury of having an electric motor or a foot pedal setup. And it doesn't mean that you can't do it. Like just drifting in a kayak is super stealthy, and that advantage in itself might be enough to outweigh the advantage of bringing your lure back naturally, as a fish might be swimming upstream with the tide as it comes in. I tend to spook more fish if I'm coming using my motor, and foot pedal would be probably the same. But with a drift, if you can just set yourself up along banks where you're just drifting with that tidal flow, you're a lot less likely to spook mangrove jack and bait fish, which is like a flow-on effect to the jacks. If you're spooking bait, then the jacks know about it and they become more wary as well. I mentioned earlier that low light periods are a bite period, and that's really what you're trying to do. Like the shadows are your friend. You're trying to deliver this lure deep into the shadows and give it as much swimming time and as much distance inside the shadow line as you can, and that's where the jacks are going to hit it, right? Or as soon as it pops out. But as soon as the shadows sort of recede and there's a lot more like high light, your chances are a lot less. So that's part of the reason why when I go skip casting, if I can help it, I'm sort of looking for those tidal runs and the early light or the late afternoon where the shadows are right out, and it just gives you more of an opportunity to get the jacks interested to come and have a bite. So the things that I'm looking for, I'm looking for lay down timber and running it along the lay down timber, skipping it underneath. And if you've got like a log that's lying down like that, bringing it over and then just letting it drop down, if you could see that, being able to do that and just stalling your retrieve when you get it over that log to let it drop down, boom, that's a great little trigger for catching a mangrove jack. And one of the things that you're looking for with these skipping plastics, which I haven't really spoken about this too much, with these paddle tails, you want to test that they're actually swimming on the way down. So you want that paddle moving, because if you're dragging it over a log and dropping it, and it dies and doesn't move, it's not as effective as a plastic that's got a tail that's beating on the way down like a swimming fish just trying to get down underneath a log. Some twigs underneath my prop here, I'll just have to fix it up. So that's how I like to fish those laydowns. And you're really trying to put a couple of different angled casts in where you're fishing around those logs, and the backs of the logs are probably the best spot to catch your jacks. That's why you're trying to get deep in there. You know, fishing the tips of the logs and that sort of thing, at times that's where a barra might sit, but generally the jack are like right up hard underneath the heaviest part of the log, or the base of the structure. So I've spoken about the gaps in between, like those little gaps in there. That's the kind of thing that you're trying to just give yourself a little run with your lure right beside the gaps. And the lay downs and things like that, ideally you want about a foot of gap between the tops of these trees and the surface water, and that's where you can fling it in, you know, and get it right in underneath. Now you come around an eroded bank like this where you can see there's lots of things that have fallen in. Often they're not as effective, right? But what you're trying to do is hit little pockets. So where this brush is, you're going to be hitting that. Some dude's tinny. You want to be hitting that. These little pockets where there's a mangrove tree, they're your targets. And often the jacks will sit right up in beside those mangrove trees. Even though they're not the biggest structure in the system, they provide a lot of shade and a lot of cover. And the bait love to sort of get in and around that stuff, and the jacks will sit in there as well. You might be able to see here, like there's this dropping away eroded bank, and then there's a bit of timber here just lying down. So just to the right of that, and that's going to come down. I'll tend to just slow my retrieve down and just slow roll my lure back over the top of that log. Even just stop my retrieve and let it sink down and get right in down there. So sometimes when you're fishing these deeper edges, it just pays to have a little bit of weight on your EWG hook and let it get right down there. I tend to, I've come up around a bend here. This is a section that I'll probably stop and switch over and fish with my much heavier setup and start to throw some diving lures to get right down into the strike zone. The skip casting is more like a high speed reaction bite where I'm trying to get, jacks coming out from shallow sections where they've been, hoarding bait up or chasing and pushing bait up into the shallows. It's not where I'm trying to get, holding fish out of deep water to come up and hit it. So I mentioned a little bit about stealth, just talking about not banging on your kayak and just drifting with the tide if you can do that. Stealth plays a huge role, because if you can get in closer in a kayak with a low profile, you can get a lot more casts as well per session. I'll probably double what I can get in my tinny with my kayak, and that's why I actually prefer skip casting out of my kayak, because I can get in closer. I don't have that presence on the water, It's just a way more effective, like efficient technique, I reckon, doing stuff like this. So having a raised seat like this definitely helps. Just helps your back as well, like you're just not caned at the end of the session. The other thing is you don't want to discount these shallower sections as well, especially if there's bait on a shallow side, like I'm talking like a foot and a half of water. That's definitely big enough, deep enough for a mangrove jack to sit in, or to sit off the edge of a drop off like that. You know, sections like this where you're fishing where it's a little bit deeper. Sometimes I reckon the shallow side is way better, and I'll just spin you around, give you a look at it. We'll go over and fish it. The reason I reckon it's worth a shot, most people don't fish it for one, but it's also got a lot of the bait path. Like the bait tends to try and hide in the shallows, and that's how they'll try and move up through a bank. So somewhere like this, it's definitely going to be bait traffic moving in and around this stuff. Probably a little bit late, because you can see like it goes way back in there, and there's a heap of brush in there now. It's like really dirtied up, and heaps of just surface muck. It's hard to fish. You can see the way that I'm doing it. I'm just like punching it in, little skip cast, boom, and then I'll just burn it back for like 2-3 meters max, and then I'll just rip it in with a high profile, with a high gear ratio reel, and just ripping it straight back in. It's really all the jacks are going to do. If they're sitting under those mangroves, they just poke straight out, bang, and back in. They don't really come following out and then hunt it down the way like you might see a trevally do, or a brim come out and, you know, follow it. The jack is just like, punch, it's mine, see you later, I'm back under. So once you get sort of like a metre out, it's all over. Try again. So it's sick. It's high repetition casting. It's like real power fishing. Your heart is constantly in your mouth, because once you get your casting down, everything is like game on. Every cast is like a potential money shot, where you're just like, oh, that deserves a fish, or whatever. So yeah, that's what I'm using, just to give you a look. It's like a flash arrow, it's a fish arrow flash J shad is what it is. It's a 4.5 inch thing on an EWG hook. And when I'm talking about skip casting, it's not always going to be like trying to skip it in. You really just, the skipping helps you get underneath stuff, but if you're just punching in between little pockets and gaps, you don't need to be skipping it necessarily. In some instances, I think it probably helps having a little skip, like that little presence, like a bait fish that's scattering and scooting in there. I really like that. But that might be me just getting off on the whole skip casting thing, I don't know. So yeah, it doesn't have to always be skipping. If you can punch one in there and just have it land straight in there, that's okay. I try to go for a subtle entry most of the time, especially once the sun's up, because everything just sort of quietens down at this point in the morning, and I don't want to be spooking fish. Hopefully this video is giving you some sort of insights in how I like to fish it. In a kayak, especially if you've got a motorised kayak or a pedal kayak, you can be ridiculously effective doing this stuff. Really stealthy. It's the perfect sort of recipe for getting out, skip casting and chasing jacks. And being able to get a jack in on a kayak is something else too. So it's a real challenge, and really enjoyable just casting exercise too. Which the boys that I just drove past this morning, like in my yak, they were in the tinny, and I was like, wow, these boys have really got it dialed. Here's some decent jack fishermen. And they're like, mate, we've just come from offshore fishing. We're just trying to learn how to do this stuff. But what I noticed about their game, like they told me after we got chatting, they were like 50 hours in, they were enjoying the casting process. And that's probably the biggest thing, is if you can get away from the heartache of donutting with these jacks, your best bet is to try and enjoy the casting aspect of it, really deliver on that and get your casting accuracy down, and the jacks will come on the back of that once you've dialed a whole lot of the game in, and the things that I've been talking about, you start to match them up and just swing little things in your favour. That's when you start to get your fish. I think that's probably why a lot of people get frustrated with jack fishing too, is they get into it, they get into the casting, they put in 20 or 30 hours, and there's just a few parts of their game that aren't quite right. Or, you know, even for me, I'll go hours and hours in sessions without catching fish, but I'm enjoying the casting and trying to deliver on that accuracy with the casting. And that's when you start to really dial it in to be able to get some better fish and some better catch rates. The whole time you're trying to get it as close as you can to the edge of the bank. Alright, so hopefully that's given you some insights into how I like to go skip casting and some tactics around it. Low light conditions, late afternoon, early morning, and then where you've got that top half of the tide with a little bit of run, I really like that. And then just being able to get your casting accuracy down and hitting absolutely everything you can find. Little gaps, the overhangs, dragging it over logs, punching it under the logs, whatever you can find is really what you're trying to do, and get that repetition by being more efficient and stealthy on the water, maybe even being in a little bit closer. Alright, so if you like this video, make sure you leave a comment in the section below and give it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe. I've got lots of these things coming. I've got heaps of tips videos planned out for the season, and a few adventures coming as well. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on these videos. I know, like, I'm not catching fish, that's jack fishing, but hopefully I'm sharing a little bit of knowledge with you that can help you next time you're on the water to get your hands on your own mangrove jack. Alright, I'll see you in the next one.